Hi, everyone. Welcome to class. I'm Dr. Tony, your professor for this class. And I'd like to give you a little presentation today on what we call informed trauma and trauma-informed care. Okay, this is very important. So to begin this, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with the definition, then move into the prevalence of trauma in society today, the impact that trauma has on what are going to be your patients and people in general. Trauma-informed care is something that we all need to take a look at because we need to learn this because trauma is very complex and there are complex traumas, and this is part of what we're going to be discussing. And the resiliency of the patient and how to work through it is going to be another topic. And I'll try to include this, to see if I can give you any references and resources. Okay, so let's start with trauma itself. What exactly are we looking at with trauma? So trauma is an event where a person can experience in many different ways. They either witness it or the victims themselves, where something actually threatens them. So there's an actual or there's a threatened death of a person, or there's a serious injury like a car accident that somebody may witness, or somebody may drive by and see, bodies strewn on the street and blood all over the place. In society today, we've been hearing a lot about shootings and the threats to physical integrity of an individual and to other people walking into a store and shooting it up, people going into classrooms and shooting students and teachers, people not responding appropriately to these situations. This is all traumatic. This all causes trauma. So when somebody experiences a trauma, there's a great deal of intense fear deep inside them that they experience. And they have the sense of being helpless. And when you're looking at helplessness in trauma, you're looking at some people that are very scared, very frightened, very troubled. And sometimes what happens is our unconscious kicks in, defense mechanisms kick in, and that fear, that helplessness gets buried within us. It's repressed within us. Sometimes the response to trauma could be horrific, could be horrifying to people. Okay, abuse, rape, incest, watching somebody get shot, somebody getting beat up. This is horrific. But it doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Somebody could be watching a movie or forced to watch a movie or forced to watch an action between two people or other people. Any type of horror can cause this trauma. And then there's the response to trauma being attached to it. There's an attachment issue there. And this is where a person is traumatized, and so much so that it gets embedded in them. And this can cause some very serious complex issues, such as dissociation, splitting. If you've ever heard of the movie Seven Faces of Eve, that type of thing, where you have multiple personalities, we used to call it. Well, right now it's called dissociative identity disorder. So when something gets attached and gets repressed or suppressed into an individual, this horrific event that makes them helpless, that causes intense fear, gets buried and stays with that person and causes a great internalized issues. So it's a prolonged exposure to something that's repetitive, something that's severe, such as childhood abuse. This is one main cause that is very, very likely to cause very lasting effects. And child abuse can start from infancy. It's not simply, oh, the kid's 10 years old. No, child abuse can start from infancy. It's traumatizing. And any type of trauma, childhood abuse and anything else after that, any type of trauma, even adolescence, adulthood, relationships, school bullying, parents yelling at their kids, any type of trauma can also occur. Neglect is one. Neglect is the absence of an essential physical or emotional care by a caregiver. The person is not soothed properly. They're not treated properly. There is no experience in them that restores them to, as we say in the addiction world, restored us back to sanity, a higher power that will restore us back. There is no higher power. When people are traumatized through neglect, you know, there's that absence of a caretaker, an absence of security. Okay, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the bottom rung of it, you know, social and security. If we don't have that security, we become extremely dysfunctional, and and mistrustful. This is Erickson's first stage: trust versus mistrust, right? So if during that infancy stage we learn to mistrust people, and that mistrust is not restored, and we learn to mistrust them because of neglect that we would have, or some type of abandonment or punishment issues, or whatever it may be, if that's not restored, the experience that we have from significant others, particularly in children, can be devastating. And that can cause a very, very complex trauma because one thing builds on another. It's interpersonal. When we interact between two people, we call this interpersonal interactions. And sometimes when we interact between people, either on our own or not on our own, maybe forced to it, and it turns into some type of violence. And we see this a lot in domestic violence. We see this, again, to reiterate, a lot in the shootings that we've been seeing in the stores. Sometimes racial injustice, not sometimes, but all the time, racial injustice, anti-Semitism, all of these isms that are out there, homophobia, any type of thing that causes any type of internal violence, internal trauma. It tends to be more than just a natural disaster. It's more disruptive, to our sense of our trust, our attachment to others. And the sad part about it is interpersonal violent trauma is intentional. People do it because they want to do it. It's not an accident. It's not something that, oh, well, just happens. It doesn't just happen. This is intentional. So you've got some very sick people or very evil people doing things to others. And as they do things to others, it really causes them, the victim, tremendous trauma. Trauma and the events associated with trauma could be personal, very private, or they could be public. For example, sexual assault. Sexual assault can be very personal. Parents assault their children. Boyfriends assault girlfriends. Girlfriends assault boyfriends, sexually and physically. Yes. Relatives, neighbors, unknowns, friends. Sexual assault. Right? Sexual abuse is another. There's a difference between sexual assault and sexual abuse. Right? Sexual assault is forced. Sexual abuse is forced, but it's also something that people do intentionally to abuse someone else over and over and over and over again. We'll see this in children that are raped or incested. We'll see this in relationships, the same thing. Another type of trauma that can happen is domestic violence. We see domestic violence a great deal, and interpersonal violence where two people, as I mentioned earlier, are conflicting. And in domestic violence, husband and wife are fighting, and we hear about this a lot. And this is one of the most dangerous situations for law enforcement. I remember when I was studying criminal justice in pre-law so many years ago, that I'll never forget what my professor said. If a police officer, and this was back in Philadelphia, if a police officer ever gets a phone call for domestic violence, they'll go all the way to the end of the county line and then return back and then go to the house to make sure things are cooled down, because these things can be very heated. Now, is that a reality? I doubt it, but this was somebody I think that was just trying to make a point in a classroom. on how dangerous it is. And we see today how peace officers and even partners, husbands and wives, are murdered, killed, shot, beaten, assaulted. Domestic violence is just horrible, and it just doesn't happen between the couple. Domestic violence happens also between the couple and sometimes the children, where the couple starts, one of the couples or both of them neglect or just turn their head the other way when a relative or neighbor comes in to sexually assault or sexually abuse one of the children. Public trauma, traumatic events happen, and we take a look at these things, and this can also have a great impact on the individual psyche when it comes to trauma. I mean, we have floods, right? Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, eruptions from volcanoes. These are natural disasters. When things are destroyed, forest fires. I mean, here in California, where I presently live, it's a big thing. It's fire season, and acres and acres and millions of acres and thousands of acres destroyed. Houses are destroyed. People have nothing. Insurance companies don't insure them because it's a risk, especially the ones that live in the tree-lined areas. A house burns, you lose everything. That's traumatic. It's a natural disaster. Then we have wars. We send our troops out to war, and I can't tell you how many times in the past, I've treated veterans, and the PTSD that they experience is horrific. And when you break them down into group, and when I've broken them down into group, and I discuss with them and talk with them, to share their experiences, runs it chills up your arm, some of the stuff that they've seen. It's horrible. But it's not only for the veterans, but you also get PTSD with the families of the veterans, because all of a sudden, they get that knock on the door, and there's the chaplain and the captain or the lieutenant that sits there and says, I regret to inform you. Now we've got, that trauma happening, and a lot of anger towards so many things. You also have, within war, you have the trauma of the war, of the people in that situation. The citizens, the civilians have nothing to do with the war except live, and they're getting bombed out and shot. And all the trauma involved in that. Again, a very complex issue. It's not just one thing. And the other part of it, of this trauma, the public trauma, is the community violence that we see. I mean, here we are, throughout, and we hear in the past Columbine, the shooting there in Pennsylvania many years ago, in the Amish country. Somebody walks in with a gun into an Amish school and kills all the children. And then we're hearing these different schools today. I mean, the other day on the news, it was like shooting after shooting after shooting being reported. Shopping centers, schools, malls, all this community violence. As we take a look at this, ask yourself the question: how do I perceive? How do I define trauma? How does it vary? How does it change amongst individuals? What does it look like with individuals? Because trauma is something that is extremely overwhelming to an individual, especially when it comes to coping skills. When we're looking at how a person copes with trauma, it can be done in so many different ways, because it just doesn't affect one little part. In Gestalt therapy, started by Fritz Perls, there's an old saying that was created from him, because the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Because one of the things with Gestalt therapy is that we take a look at the individual as a whole, first of all, to see what we're looking at. But then as we start to get into them psychologically, we take a look and we see all these different factions, all these different behaviors, likes, dislikes, issues, parts, pieces, traumas, events, all of these different things from the outside stimulus that comes in and attacks the individual or the individual's psyche. When that happens, the person gets traumatized, and we take a look at that individual, because don't forget, we also have defense mechanisms that tend to bury to protect the host. Unfortunately, when these defense mechanisms kick in and they help the person, but also hurt the person, because as they defend and they bury, it also causes splits within the person, and these splits are called dissociations. So it affects the whole person psychologically. Trauma also affects the person, if we take a look at it physically. The physicality of trauma is unbelievable. Persons losing sleep, losing weight, cutting themselves, right? The borderline, making suicidal gestures, suicidal attempts, weight gain, depression, you move into the emotional realm, depressions and anxiety disorders and bipolar disorders that are complicated, and more dissociations, all of this stuff. And when you're traumatized, it affects, again, another whole part of the system. It affects people intellectually. Have you ever been traumatized and try to think? You can't. You can't think. Sometimes what happens is that trauma can be caused, if you will, through academics. You get a professor or a teacher that's relentless, uncaring, could give, nothing for you, and sits there and pushes and pushes and pushes. You have a problem. You're called stupid. You're called dumb. Your test grades are there. Oh, I don't understand something. Why aren't you reading the material? The attitudes, it affects your intellectual capacity. Also, if you're sound, if that hasn't happened to you, all right, and let's say you're at a job and you're doing great at the job and you're wonderful at the job and all this stuff, but you've experienced the trauma, and sometimes that trauma leads to a dissociation, and that dissociative identity comes out at the job, and now you're not working out of the host persona, you're working out of the dissociated persona. That can cause a problem intellectually. It can cause a problem physically. It can cause a problem communally, within the community and socially at work. And this sometimes can cause you to lose a job, or cause an individual to lose a job. Imagine a scenario. Somebody's going through the police academy, right? Or the fire academy, either or, it doesn't matter, but some type of academy, or through medical school and become a surgeon. And they've experienced trauma throughout their life, right? And all of a sudden, as they're doing their job, the persona comes out. Imagine a traumatized persona coming out if you're a surgeon and you're doing a major heart operation, or a police officer, and you're driving in your cruiser, and the second person kicks in and you've got a traffic stop, and that person is not a very nice person, but you, the host, are. Imagine things like this because somebody was traumatized from way back when. Trauma also affects people spiritually, and there's a lot of anger. I'm a bishop. One of the things that I do, I'm an archbishop in a church. And one of the things that I see are these spiritually disengaged people, where they wonder why God did these things to them, when God had very little to nothing to do with it. It was these sick people on the outside, and it's just very, the issues involved are just very, very problematic for everyone. So as we look at the trauma, we also look at things like the prevalence of the trauma, and what we do about it. As you go into being a therapist and a clinician, okay, one of the things that's going to be very, very important to you is when you have a patient that's a child and tells you, somebody touched me here, somebody touched me there, Oh, I've had sex for quite some time. I started when I was 3 years old, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be your duty as a mandated reporter to report these incidences, right? Every 10 seconds in the United States alone, every 10 seconds, there's a child abuse report being made, And let me give you some stats on this, right? Seriously. These stats are realistic. They come from the Child Welfare Information Gateway, and they come from the year 2006. So 59% of child abuse is due to neglect. And out of that 59%, the reason for that 59%, those individuals are likely to be juvenile offenders, with 2.8% of them more likely to be arrested as an adult, and 30% to commit violent crimes. Okay, that's pervasive, and historically, trauma is, how can I put this? Trauma is very pervasive and very great in the United States amongst children, especially children, according to Marchenik in 2009, from diversely culturally based backgrounds. So diversity plays a role in trauma. And a lot of times we'll have children from different cultures intermingling and coming into existence and working within society, and they're persecuted by others. It's a beautiful thing to be multicultural in one's own persona. But that's you and your family. When you step outside of your family, it can be very traumatic, because now society comes in. Sometimes your own culture will come in and sit there and be very ruthless to you. And that causes trauma, because now there's a great sense of insecurity in society, a sense of belonging. And where's that? And then you've got the racial profiling and all the other stuff that comes along with it. If you're a child and you have a disability, chances are the disabled child will be neglected, and as opposed to those without disabilities. And that material is seen, and you can view that on the Child Welfare Information Gateway 2006. There's a lot of these children that are neglected, really don't know spiritually, intellectually, physically, emotionally, psychologically, how to interact within a society. So as we're looking at the child neglect and the child abuse that happens, there are more than, I would say, maybe 1 in 3 women themselves, which is approximately 35.6%. And this comes from the Center of Disease Control in 2013. About 35.6%, more than 1 in 4 men, which is about 28.5% or so in the United States, have experienced rape, physical violence, stalking from an intimate partner and others. I used to work at the San Quentin State Prison in California for 5 years. And I treated the guys on death row, administrative segregation, and the adjustment center. And occasionally I would be in the lower yard and deal with the lifers that are not on death row. And talking with I could see where these numbers come from, because a lot of the men talk to me and they says, when I asked them about their crimes and all that, and their behaviors, a lot of them had told me that they were raped and molested by their fathers, their uncles, some neighbors, some friends. Maybe their mother was divorced and had a boyfriend come in, and the boyfriend raped. I mean, it's out there. It's terrible. It's terrible. And I did not have the privilege of dealing with female offenders, but some of the individuals, my colleagues I spoke to that did deal with female offenders, were telling me stories of how many of them, and from them, had mental illnesses, you know, because of their physical and sexual abuse. And it's horrific. In 2009, Marchenik did a study on this and came up with approximately 80% of female offenders met that profile. 80%. This is trauma. This is the prevalence of trauma. And many clients, within the public mental health system and the substance abuse patients that you're going to be treating are trauma survivors. Ask them. Ask them. Maybe one of you that's listening to this is a trauma survivor and decided, you want to go into the field of addiction studies, to help those people. God bless you. Believe me, it's needed out there. We're looking at tremendous numbers. Picture the 75% of women and men, okay, in treatment that you're going to be treating in substance abuse have trauma histories. Take a look at Samson in their CSAT, right? Take a look at Samson's articles and their tip and tap series. You'll see about 2000 Samson did something, and that they came up with. There was a study by the CDC and by a few other physicians, that came up with a research study that dealt with approximately 17,000 people, participants. And these people had adverse childhood experiences. And part of the study showed how these adverse childhood experiences, the rapes, the incest, the beatings, and all that stuff, cause physical and emotional problems throughout the lifespan. And how these traumatic experiences, were recognized in the past, and nothing's been done with it. And that in and of itself causes a trauma, because now we have that neglect bit coming in. So we see that children have some type of a bad experience. Let's start there. Let's see how trauma is framed and how trauma evolves. Okay, take a few moments. So we see that they have a child would have an adverse experience. From there, their neurological development is hindered. Their wiring, right? Neglect leads to bad wiring in the brain. So their neurological development is disrupted. It's wired a certain way, and it's embedded in the person. So now we're looking at a neurological issue here. That issue builds into some type of socio-emotional difficulty, dysfunction, which interrupts with cognitions, the way you once think, and impairs their interactions sociologically. So we have here a social, emotional, cognitive type of disruption that's impaired because of the wiring that was set because of the adverse experience. Then, eventually what winds up happening is the person becomes sick. They start to have health issues. And these health issues also lead to risky behavior patterns for some of them. suicidal attempts, the ideations, the acting out, and all of this. So as we can see, these actions are derived from their social, emotional, and cognitive issues, the impairments that they received from their wiring, what was wrong, from their adverse experiences. As this builds in a person, right, what are we looking at? We're looking at somebody that all of a sudden is very susceptible to diseases, very susceptible to different types of disabilities. I don't necessarily mean physical, I mean emotional disabilities. They can't concentrate, they can't work, they can't do things, they have dissociations, all of this stuff. And you put something like that into a society, what do we have? We've got major social problems: rejection, neglecting, we have violence, and people that are traumatized, eventually, that have these things, sometimes they meet with early death. And these early deaths are extremely, sometimes very violent. And these violent tendencies, it doesn't necessarily have to be violent, but these violent tendencies, a lot of times will come in because what's going on inside the person physically and psychologically are so tremendous, they just can't handle life anymore, and they become suicidal. Then again, the way that the wiring is and the pressure put on the physical person, well, the physical person can only take so much, and then it starts to deteriorate and break down. So we'll see a higher rate of heart conditions, diabetes, other types of physical ailments, which also shorten the lifespan. Drug addiction plays into here, which shortens the lifespan. People start smoking at an early age, and we all know how dangerous smoking is, and that includes marijuana. Okay, so there's no excuses. All of these things to try to ease and self-soothe the person, are very traumatic and can lead to a great deal of early deaths. So looking at trauma in society, looking at trauma on the individual, looking at trauma on the family, we have a survival instinct. So somebody that's traumatized needs to make it in the world. And, we see this a great deal out in the wild, with animals that are caged, or animals that are threatened. They want to survive, and that's called a survival instinct. So if people are traumatized and the survival instinct kicks in, we have a hypothalamic response in the brain called fight or flight. And you're either going to sit there and run from the thing that's traumatizing you, or you're going to stand there and you're going to fight to the bitter end. And this goes on psychologically as well as physically. Sometimes we also have this situation where when trauma comes in, we freeze. This part is the dissociation. I remember treating a patient, and she was in tears, and it was a very sad patient, very sad time for this individual. She was discussing with me the incest that was happening within family, and to her and her siblings and cousins, because it was intergenerational. And one of the things she told me is, I started out not knowing what was going on, and then when I realized what was happening, I couldn't stop it because the person that was doing it was overpowering. And all I did was froze. And they did what they wanted to do because I just didn't want to feel it anymore, and I didn't feel it. That's called dissociation. And this went on for years and years and years. And it took a while because this person wanted to get married, was in love with this guy and wanted to become intimate. But whenever they tried to become intimate, she froze and felt nothing. And it was very discouraging. And she lost many people that way. Fortunately, we were able to work through it. And I had psychiatry in there and a few other interventions to help me out with this case because it was a very difficult case. But she was a survivor. She was a trauma survivor. And this freezing that she experienced just leads to submission to the perpetrator. And it happens across everything. I'm serious, not only families or individual people, but also in the animal world as well, because we just shut down. When people are traumatized, they just shut down completely. They can't rationalize at the time. They can't deal with things at the time. It's I don't know what else to say with that. I mean, it's so horrific to watch that because the impact is just so prolonged, and the more you're exposed, the longer the impact. And then, we take a look at the history of trauma in an individual, and we see behaviors over time being repeated, not necessarily on the part of the victim, but on the part of the perpetrator. And then what happens is, again, remember the wiring I was talking about? Well, that's the only type of person that victim can respond to. So now we see the victim repeating the traumatic event over and over and over again, which will cause them, more trauma. So they're traumatizing the trauma. So any type of natural alarm system, as Hooper 2009 would put it, any type of natural alarm system inside the system says, hey, this is danger, get away, doesn't work anymore. It just doesn't work anymore. Because what's happening with the individual is they've created emotional and physical responses to a stress event. So this response, this freezing, this all this other kinds of stuff that have happened, the fighting, the flighting, the freezing, the submissions, the shutting down, all of this stuff creates an emotional and a physical response that they trained themselves to do, or I should say the mind and the body trained them to do, which would be better, as a response to that stress and the emotional numbing. Because now the person becomes emotionally numb, psychologically avoidant, and everything that's around them, they just like stimulus response. You give me a stimulus, I'm going to respond to it. I'm not attached to it. And this causes detachment. The more detachment happens, the more dissociation occurs. So affectively, emotionally, that's what I mean when I say affectively, right? An individual's sense of safety is threatened. So now they don't feel safe. So now all they are is defense mechanism. And defense mechanism kicks in, and defense mechanism makes them safe instead of them protecting and self-soothing. Trauma. So what this does is this takes an individual that has been traumatized. This takes an individual's ability to trust someone else. And you'll see that people that have been traumatized have very little trust for other people. There tends to be, when we see the social interaction, especially with PTSD and people that interact with that, we happen to see what we call hyperarousal occur. Hyperarousal is when somebody gets very nervous. Have you ever been in a situation where all of a sudden, you just jump and look around, right? You get this jumpiness feeling, right? Or you're walking down the street and a backfire of a car, or maybe somebody drops something and you get jolted, right? And you're very hyper vigilant. You're everything around you is right there, and it's almost like you're in a room that resonates, and any little pin drop just it's hyper arousal. anything that can stimulate a memory from a past event. And we'll see this a lot with people in battle that have been in war zones where planes fly over and drop the bombs or gunfire and things of that nature. They all of a sudden they walk into a neighborhood and they hear a popping. It could be fireworks, it could be anything, but hear a popping. And they panic and they get afraid. I remember out here in the California area, San Francisco Bay, they have something every year called Fleet Week. It's where the Navy has the Blue Angels fly overhead and do their little maneuvers and all this stuff. Well, at this one residential that I was treating at called Treasure Island, it was a place for all vets. That was a very dangerous week. I remember the times I used to work there. The vets that were super traumatized with PTSD would just freeze in their tracks when the jets would go over. Some of them would be ducking under any cars that were over there or hiding, and others would just crawl up into a bowl and start crying, out of fear. This is how bad PTSD is, because the psyche's been traumatized and there were really nothing there for them to protect. So they'll avoid, they'll avoid feeling. That's about the best way to put it. They will avoid feeling. So they'll blank out, they'll dissociate. And instead of feeling something, they'll just numb out. They'll shut down. They'll separate from everything that we know as normal. They'll pull away from relationships. They'll pull away from people, pull away from activities. They'll pull away from events. They'll pull away from the normal routine of every day. Anything that can trigger a memory, a traumatic memory, surfaces. And as it surfaces, then they have that response. So now we have an idea of how trauma occurs, how trauma happens, what trauma is about, and how complex it is. The idea that we want to do when we treat trauma is to understand that the person needs to be stable. We need to find a way to make that person stable. And the way to reach stability is to have that person feel safe within their own skin. So one way of doing that is for that person, instead of running away from, and this is going to sound very strange, instead of running away from the trauma into themselves and burying it, causing these dissociations and problems, is to run to the trauma and be able to process it in a very safe and secure and stable environment. So that way they can reconnect with society, but most importantly, reconnect with themselves. That's been buried for so long and traumatized for so long. And that's done through a gradual reintegration process into the self, which leads to a gradual reintegration process into society. So let's take a look at stabilization, and let's take a look at how one can be safe within that, okay? So we need to take a look at the person's basic needs. How can we make a connection between what they need and the resources outside of them and inside of them to make them feel comfortable so that they can take care of themselves and they can identify with a safe, sober, secure support system outside, because these two need to be integrated together: self-care and self-support. Then they need to start to focus on self-regulation, as Marshall Linehan in dialectical behavioral therapy would say, and emotional regulation, right? And what this does is this teaches the person through emotional regulation to what we call self-soothe. It makes them comfortable, if you will, within their own skin. And part of this is done by educating them on trauma and to de-victimize them. And that's got to be part of the treatment process to get them to de-victimize themselves. And some of them don't even realize that they're being victimized, that they're a victim. They're so used to it. The wiring of the brain has to be rewired, if you will. The next thing we have to do is we got to process things, because once you have a memory exposed, very frightful memory, that's been with you forever. That memory, that affect, that feeling has become part of you. And we're asking you in therapy to get rid of it, right? To lose it. It's like the drug addict. You get a drug addict and that's been doing drugs for 40 years and comes to you and says, I want to get off crack cocaine. How long have you been doing it? 40 years. Okay, we're going to have to stop using it. We're going to make you do that. How many times is that person going to relapse because they're right there, because it's a part of them. Well, the trauma is a part of them until they're ready to give it up. And that takes a long time in psychotherapy to do, because they have to, you ready? Grieve the loss. Yeah. Just like the addict has to grieve the loss of them not using anymore, the trauma survivor has to grieve the loss of that trauma. The goal of it is to have the patient acknowledge and experience what's going on inside them. This happened. I experienced it. This is what's happening now. This is what I'm experiencing now. And this is how it happened back then and why it happened back then. And then once they acknowledge and experience it, they have to do normalization. They have to sit there and say, for me at this time, this was the way it was, but I have to change that and I have to feel better again. I have to normalize things in myself and within society. My emotions, my thought processes, my associations with everybody and everything has to be normalized, right? And trauma has to be wiped out. It has to be normalized, but it has to be done in therapy in a way that is systematic, in a way that is safe. The person has to feel safe, or else you're going to re-traumatize them. In an environment that's safe, you have to be safe for the person, and it has to be manageable. Don't try, when you're treating a patient, don't try to bite off more than what you can chew. The hell with the insurance companies when they sit there and they say you got 10 sessions. 10 sessions just starts with hi. That's it. That's 10 sessions, right? Expect this. You get a patient that's deeply traumatized, especially with a complex trauma. It's not going to take 10 sessions. It's going to take a while, okay? Because that person has to reconnect with themselves. They have to reconnect with society. They have to build within themselves, and you have to help them get a firm and a new sense of self. Who am I? What am I? Am I this scared person that's been traumatized? Am I going to continue that for the rest of my life? Is that who I am? Or is there something different and deeper? This is where the rewiring comes in, the neurological rewiring. Because remember, they're wired to accept the trauma and anything that comes in. To rewire that, they have to be able to reconnect circuits, and they have to be able to feel good within themselves. They got to develop friendships. They've got to develop support systems. They got to redevelop intimacies between themselves within and intimacies without, to build trust within themselves and to build trust without themselves. They have to deal with things spiritually. You know, if they believe in God or not, there's still a spiritual aspect of a person. And that spiritual aspect of the person needs to be a part of strength, because that's the part that we can't see. See, spirituality is a relationship. It's not a religion. Religion is different. I'm not talking religion. I'm talking, a relationship. That's spirituality. And the relationship has to be between myself If I'm traumatized, I've got to have that intimacy within. I got to make a friend of myself first. I've got to learn what that means on the outside, become intimate and friendly with other people. And the only way I can do that is mystically, spiritually, because I've got to learn to make those connections. So within each and every one of us, there is a power greater than ourselves that can lead us to sanity, as the first step says in AA, right? A higher power that will lead us to sanity. That higher power is a spiritual power that is within each and every one of us. So when we're looking at trauma-informed care of a patient, according to Alvarez and Sloan, they did some work in 2010, the aim is to not victimize oneself, to stop re-victimizing oneself. The traumatized person no longer can see themselves as being a victim. It's my fault. I did something that I shouldn't have done. I deserve what I get. That's got to stop. The person has to appreciate that the problems that they started with in their behaviors are problems that everybody has, not necessarily the action, but the problems caused by the actions, the emotional issues, the depression, the anger, the anxiety, all that, everybody experiences them. So you're in a group. Now, the causation is one thing, the effect is something else, right? So they have to understand that. They've got to be able to cope with that. And as they're doing that, you have to teach them as a therapist, as a clinician, you have to teach them what choices to make that are appropriate choices for their survival. And you can walk with them a certain way, but as you do therapy with them, don't forget you're a coach. Like it or not, you are a coach, you're a change agent. And part of what you have to do is you have to teach them not only to cope with it and how to survive with it, but how to control the healing process as it goes along. Because remember, when you're dealing with a complex trauma, that healing is going to be very long. It's not 10 sessions, right? And you have to deal with this at the rudimentary aspect of it. Look at the person as an individual living in a cultural society. What is that individual's society and culture? Because culture has a lot to do with identity and has a lot to do with healing and has a lot to do with the rewiring. So we need to take a look at that individual's culture and find out what's acceptable and not acceptable in that culture, right? In Greek culture, in the ADs, 30 AD, 30 BC, all of this stuff in the Greek culture, homosexuality was the thing. It was it. It was not unheard of that men would sleep with men, women would sleep with women. That's just the way it was, and it was seen as very normal in society. Okay, so you need to take a look at the culture. Is abuse in a culture acceptable? I'm not saying that homosexuality is abusive. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is, something that we would see as abnormal now was very normal back then, and things that are very normal now are going to be seen as abnormal 100 years or 1,000 years from now. Weird the way that works, huh? But you need to understand the culture. They need to be competent, and you need to be competent in their culture and see what works and what doesn't work. And if things need to be adjusted, you need to adjust it on that level, because you need to understand that each survivor is within the context of that society's life experiences and that society's cultural background. And that's where they are going to live their life. One of my biggest pet peeves in addictions treatment and also in psychotherapy, when I do both of them together, right? We get a person that comes in the clinic and wants to get off of drugs, and let's say they got 30 days, and in 30 days they learn all these wonderful things, okay? And after they learn these wonderful things, what do? Put them back where they came from. And then we wonder why there's relapse, because nothing is being done in society. So our job is to teach them how to cope if they have to go back to that mess, with the understanding that they may remedicate the pain of trauma with the substances. Or there's another thing, they can become resilient. That individual can have the capacity to successfully cope in the face of very, very significant changes that are adverse against them and are risky. They can do that. They can change. They have the capacity to change, but it happens over time. So the person that comes into treatment, goes back into society, may relapse a few times, but then if they come back to you, you teach them how to cope with that, so that the relapses get shorter and shorter and shorter and shorter, to the point where they become resilient. And it's like, oh yeah, there's Sidney the cop man again. The hell with him. Let me move on. And that's it. They become very resilient. They get this shield. I'm not talking about dissociation. I'm not talking about blocking. I'm not talking about burying the emotion, the affect. I am not talking about that. I'm talking about resiliency, which is the capacity to change over time. Okay? That's resiliency. They change over time. But in order to do that, they have to be protected. They have to feel protected. And they have to be able to protect themselves, and to start to pull on society around them, and start to learn how to trust people that can also help them to trust. Okay? Because there's behaviors that they have, there's characteristics that they have, and there's qualities that they have within themselves. And that structures their personality. And those characteristics and those qualities and those behaviors shape them and assist that individual to recover after the exposure to the trauma. But that has to be taught. Again, the rewiring process, because they've been taught the exact opposite of that their behaviors, their characters, their qualities, their personalities are set. This is who I am, and this is for the rest of my life, and that's just not true. But to get them to believe that and to practice it, it's going to be a journey. The biggest thing is protection, right? Because you're living in an environment, and part of the environment that they're living in, okay, it has to be an environment that supports them, an environment that's very reliable. And this environment can be from family, from friends, from church, from school, whatever. But it has to be a safe environment for them. So their internal structure, which I'm going to call an internal house, has to be safe. Their external environment, their external house, has to be safe. And the care that you give them has to be slow, systematic, and timely. Do not rush therapy. Therapy cannot be rushed. The healing process takes a while when it comes to complex trauma. We just scratch the surface. Don't think you have the answers as a therapist, because you don't. The patient has the answer. The answer comes from the one who answers the question. The only problem is that answer has been buried through trauma. And it's our job, in concert with the patient, to be able to sort through those issues so that they can take a look at those behaviors, those events, and those traumatizing things, and gradually work through them. So that when they start to change their thoughts, their behavior changes, right? And as their behavior changes, they start to get what we call good hygiene, right? Their self-care starts to improve. They get to sleep better. The hypervigilance starts to go down, right? They wake up in the morning a little bit more refreshed as opposed to totally exhausted because they've been fighting with nightmares and everything else, right? They get the right medical treatment, the right psychological treatment. They're starting to eat better. They're starting to get out a little bit more, socialize, exercise. Their boundaries, are no longer starting to be invaded. They're stopping that, right? Which they did not know how to do before. But with your help as a clinician, you're teaching them how to restructure and practice appropriate boundaries. And this is because they finally learned how to cope universally, if you will, right? How to cope within themselves, how to cope with their emotions, how to regulate their emotions, how to be in the right here and now, in the present, mindfulness exercises. Thank you, Marshall Linehan, right? All this stuff. All these defense mechanisms that were negative, they're being tamed and they're being discarded and only drawn upon when they have to be and not because they are there, right? So coping mechanisms take over those irreversible mechanisms that take away from positivity or goodness within an individual. And this makes the person very resilient. And once you have a resilient person, now you have somebody that's no longer scared and they want to approach life with a different type of attitude. Now they have a sense of who I am, a sense of meaningfulness, both here and also meaning in life. Life isn't constantly negative and harmful to me anymore. See? And now they have this internal sense of security, which is called an internal locus of control. They control themselves as opposed to an external locus of control. Something out there controls me, mainly the violence and the abuse and all that stuff that's been out there. That's an external locus of control. That's controlled my behavior. No, that's got to stop. So now they need that internal sense of security and safety, that internal locus of control, where they themselves control what's going on around them. And around them, the external locus of control does not interfere with them. So the ability of a person to bounce back from change is that sense of internal locus of control, that sense of feeling, that sense of commitment. So once they have this internal sense of control, the person now starts to grow, right? So now we have this trauma from the past. They've learned the internal locus of control, self-control, and the ability to like themselves and control things around them instead of having the around them control them. So now from the trauma, we now have the healing or the post-traumatic growth, okay? This happens when, as Armour in 2007 would say, a resilient survivor continues to grow or even thrive in spite of, and quite often because of their history. It's very powerful. It gives the person the ability to survive in a society that they could never survive in before because of their history. Trauma survivors who are able to be stronger in the things that they do and find the, as the Greeks would say, the Sophia, the wisdom, to allow them, give them permission, give themselves permission to grow emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, physically, within a relationship with themselves and with others, are often called survivors. And this is what we need to do as clinicians. We need to be able to have the people experience this after trauma, this post-traumatic growth. And we'll see this when we see the person's relationships getting stronger within themselves, relationship with themselves getting stronger, but relationships outside themselves getting stronger, and they start to have a connection with their own feelings as opposed to a dissociation of their own feelings. So it begins. I'm feeling this way because this event happened. I'm sad, and I'm allowed to be sad because I'm happy because this happened outside of me. And I'm allowed to be happy. It's okay. We used to call that back in the 70s and the 80s when I was first learning psychology and all this clinical stuff. We used to say, own it, name it, and claim it for your own. And that's what the person has to do. Because what that does is it gives somebody a good connectiveness and a congruency, if you will, between what's going on inside them and outside of them. Their locus of control within takes over the locus of control without. So now we have the trauma survivor having their own locus of control within, and the external locus of control stays out there and controls somebody else, but not them. That gives themselves a sense of personal strength and awareness that, oh my gosh, this is life. And these are all the possibilities of life. And this is what can happen. And that is the ins and outs of survival of a complex trauma. Okay, so I want to thank you for watching this, probably quite lengthy, but I want to thank you for watching this. And I also want to thank you for taking part of this, and please integrate this. Know your boundaries as a counselor, as a therapist. Know that, when you're dealing with somebody that has a trauma or a complex trauma, that you're probably out of your ballpark. You're going to need a team to work on this. Do what you can do within what you can do. But outside of that, get psychiatry, get social work, get psychiatry, get psychology, get the drug and alcohol counselor, get that team. We call this milieu therapy. Because once we get that, we can help a lot of people. Thank you again. And I hope you got something out of this. Bye for now.